All right. Well, I am here today with Casey Dorman. He is the author of "Is God Really Necessary? A Glimpse into the Mind of an Atheist." And I have recently read his book, enjoyed his sort of meditation on essentially living as an atheist. And I guess I'll actually ask him his kind of his goal and his vision for the book in a moment. But because I did find it thought provoking, enjoyed reading it, I wanted to take an opportunity to have him join me to talk about a couple of issues related to our mutual interests, and specifically focusing on first morality and kind of its foundation and how you live a moral life, and then secondly, the issue of miracles. So, with that in mind, thank you for joining me today.
Sure.
And could you give me sort of an idea? This book that you've written, it seems very personal, sort of very reflective. What sparked you to write this book?
Um, yeah, I actually had a very specific purpose in writing the book. I had been involved with a nonviolence peace group, and through some internet chats and phone chats, and we were kind of planning some strategies for programs, and they were emphasizing a very spiritual tone to what they were doing. And so I had kind of objected by saying, well, I don't want you to leave people out by doing this. There are people like myself who are not spiritual who are going to be left out of this conversation if you place too much emphasis upon that. And they said, well, you mean you're not religious, you're actually spiritual. And I said, no, I mean I'm not spiritual. And they said, well, you must be spiritual because you believe the same things we do, and we're spiritual. So I said, well, that's not true. And I decided that I would write it down in a book, what I meant by not being spiritual, and yet state what my values were and try to show I actually wasn't writing to convince anybody of anything other than sort of plead my own case that you don't need to be spiritual in order to have values similar to people who are spiritual. And so, which I think will be some of what we talk about today, because I suspect that some of our moral values are very similar to one another, and they may have actually originated from the same places, because I was raised in a religious background myself, and we were raised in the same American culture, so we have a lot of things in common. But I tried to explain that, really to explain myself and what some of it was what I meant by not being spiritual, which really isn't the point of our conversation, but for me meant I'm a materialist
Right.
through and through. I don't think there is anything other than matter and energy and whatever else physicists happen to find in that realm that can be verified. So,
Right. Well, excellent. Yeah, and I asked to some extent because I think that actually leads us very nicely into this area that I think would be interesting for us to explore. Then, as you talk of values and shared values, and I actually agree. I think if there was some way to test, what our moral reflexes are, you and I would probably look pretty similar.
mhm,
And I think that's something, it's maybe helpful to start with where we agree. And I would say certainly that your values probably look similar to mine. And I would say that I don't know you very well, but most likely you're a good, decent person. The idea that that I think unfortunately some Christians even kind of perhaps carelessly act as if if you're an atheist you can't be a good person, quote unquote.
mm,
That's something that frankly I don't even see in Scripture. That the Bible indicates that you can have what sometimes I'll call the the noble pagan, in the sense of just somebody who doesn't, and no insult intended by the phrase, but that sense from the perspective of the Christian, somebody who doesn't believe, somebody who doesn't have a religious faith and yet recognizes uh, values and
right.
tries to be a again quote unquote good person. So I think reading, you had also sent me the article that you had written sort of in relation to moral relativism and
Right.
your reading of the book The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And looking at your discussion there, I'm thinking that essentially we would agree that there are things that I feel are wrong. You know, I would say there's things that are wrong, and you would agree that there's things that you feel are wrong. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's sort of. I think I tried to say in that paper that despite my trying to recognize that other people have different values and different reasons for their different values, and that many of my values are probably culturally specific, there are some bottom line values that I am not willing to give up or say are relative, even though I guess I would still might say they're culturally determined. But I'm not willing. But I believe they should be universal values.
There you go. Okay, right, right. I think that's a good way of putting it. So essentially, then, when you say these, these should be universal values, what is what leads you to that they should be universal, or what do you mean by that, perhaps?
Okay. Um, they are there are values that I think are necessary for what I would call a decent survival of humanity. For instance, not to take someone else's life, except perhaps in self-defense, and I would say that perhaps that's necessary, but not taking it through revenge, not taking it through war, not taking it in order to steal, not taking it, all these other reasons. And that to me is a bottom line kind of thing to show to respect the vulnerability of children. I think I mentioned that there are people who are innocent and unable to protect themselves and deserve the protection of the rest of us. So I think that's kind of a bottom line value
Sure.
of mine.
And I think, honestly, if I don't really, listening, if I check all those off, it's like, yep, you just described a significant chunk of my moral code too. So again, we've got that agreement. And where I think it would be interesting to explore then is it seems like if we would explain then where those values, we could say, perhaps come from, or what's their foundation, differently. In that my explanation would be that they're ultimately rooted in God's nature, that there is a God, that God is absolutely good, and essentially those things which are like God then would be good. That God is love, therefore love is good, etc., etc. And therefore, I think I remember one person I read said that for the Christian, ethics is rooted in ontology, that right and wrong are rooted in the being of God. And so that makes then right and wrong absolute, that what's right for me is right for you, is right for the person on the other end of the world. And I think from my reading of you, and I'd like you to sort of fill in the gaps here, but essentially you would say that right and wrong are evolved and then sort of culturally conditioned or determined. Would that be a fair?
Yes, yes, that there are certain values, certain things that we have a gut feeling are right and wrong, even though our gut feeling can be overridden by culture. But we have a gut feeling are right and wrong that I think are probably determined through evolution, and I think that because of my reading of evolution, but also because the behaviors that are determined by those values. For instance, the reciprocal behavior of if you give me something, I will give you something in return, can be seen in other species. I think I even mentioned in my book, from chimpanzees to vampire bats,
dolphins, and lots.
All sorts of things. So that there's some likelihood that even though we may tell ourselves that we are following the golden rule when we, do that. In fact, we probably made up the golden rule to fit what we felt was the right behavior rather
Right.
than vice versa. There are other things, and in one of them I talk about in the moral relativity paper,
Hmm.
like that freedom of speech is a value, is one that I think is not something we inherited. First of all, it would be hard. It's hard to inherit speech,
Right.
evolutionarily, or particularly certain phrases.
Yeah.
Um,
Chimpanzees don't have much of a freedom of speech.
right, right. They don't have freedom of speech, and vampires even less.
Indeed.
Um, and those are things that I see not being as valuable as values such as, and another one would be, it's not, it's bad, let's say, to criticize, or if I use biblical terms, curse the Lord.
Hmm.
Okay. That's something else that I don't think we inherited that. I think that's something that our culture taught us. And in that case, we see conflicts in the world, that some people think that um, uh, uh, insulting what God,
Hmm.
or insulting a prophet,
Muhammad or whatever. Yeah.
Muhammad, uh, uh, strong is a stronger value than freedom of speech. You're not
Hmm.
free to do that. Other
Sure.
people in the world feel that no, you're free to do whatever you want, and to try to punish somebody because they insulted someone's God is a violation of a higher value, which is freedom of speech. Those I think are culturally relative, so that one
Right.
would say one's a value, one's another. So they're two sets of values, and probably they what we actually have as values are on some kind of gradient, because a lot of our values, and this is one of Haight's position in his book, which is that even he had six moral dimensions he
Right.
felt were evolutionarily determined, but then depending on which culture you grew up, they were either either favored by that
Hmm.
culture or not, and so you're more likely to believe them. So I think that most of our values that any of us have are somewhere on this gradient of evolutionarily determined versus culturally determined.
Great.
And I would and you, I won't go to. I'll stop. I talk too much. That
No
is
worries.
one of the difficulties that I have. That's not a value that I have to talk a lot, but it's something that I do in spite of it. Um, which is that when I say evolutionarily determined, I ultimately I'm talking about a concept, but I'm also talking about something feels right. Although I'm not sure we can determine what feels right
Hmm.
on an evolutionary basis from what feels right on a cultural basis, but it
Sure.
may be similar to what you say, kind of ontogenetically, you have as God's nature. If you feel that God's nature is built into us as human beings, or we reflect God's nature, then some things may feel right for the same reasons we just attach.
Hmm.
I pick evolution, you pick God.
Sure. So yeah. So that's I think, yeah, as well summarized, of that picture of, again, evolution, a sort of, for reasons of survival. That is obviously, to the degree, and I certainly, let's not go down the full evolution rabbit trail at the moment.
Okay.
But I would certainly say that I would grant the idea that, the basic survival of, the survival of the fittest,
Mm.
that species adapt to their environment, etc., and that uh, within evolution, then, those traits that you develop as a species would be shaped by, the pressures of survival. This is something that is a survival benefit. And you laid out how, even things that might not be selfish, we tend to think of survival being a selfish quality,
Right.
but that in fact, if we think of it, I am part of my family, part of my clan, part of my whatever group, and therefore, if I go out and altruistically get killed for my tribe, that
Right.
may actually help everybody else in the tribe who has some of my, who are related to me somehow, and therefore
Right.
those unselfish genes are passed along, and there's that survival benefit that
Correct.
comes from being good.
Yeah.
Now, so that I would actually agree could be an explanation of why we have sort of an innate sense of X, fill in what X is, but X is good or X is bad. But what I'm intrigued by, and this is kind of the point where I find it somewhat this explanation that you've offered, at least at first glance, unsatisfactory, is that this seems to explain to me why we would think that things are wrong.
Mhm.
Why we would have an instinctive sense of, I have a gut level revulsion from, murdering my neighbor.
Right.
Sort of in the same way that I have a gut level attraction to food or
Mm.
to shelter, those sorts of things. That those are evolutionarily just ingrained. You want this or you
Right.
don't want that, and that could explain then that feeling of I should not do this.
Mhm.
But what that doesn't seem like it can explain is the fact that we really don't interact with moral principles in that way as mere instincts. When if I'm hungry and I don't eat, I don't feel guilty.
Mhm.
And I don't have, I thought it was interesting, even as you, in your article on moral relativism, thinking on the Righteous Mind book, you said, I think the closing line was that you felt like the article or the book had kind of helped you to be, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but perhaps more open-minded or more tolerant or more understanding
Mhm.
of other points of views. And I think you said something along the lines of that was a step forward,
Yeah.
the sense of this is how it should be. And if I could maybe draw an analogy to how where I feel like this explanation is failing, is imagine that we're out in the forest, and I come across a sign, and the sign says, uh, thou shalt uh, thou shalt give 20% of your income to uh, bear preservation, and it's just a sign there. Now I could recognize that sign. I could even recognize that it carries with it a feeling of imperative. That I ought to do this thing, or that's what it's trying to
Mhm.
communicate to me anyway. But I don't think that I would feel. I wouldn't feel that I actually had to. That
Mhm.
it wasn't. Perhaps we could say, really right to
Mhm.
obey that thing. And it seems like in other areas we can distinguish between that impulse that I feel on an instinctive level, and then a right or a wrong, a moral, I should do this or I shouldn't do this. And so it seems to me that your explanation can explain why I feel that something is wrong,
Mhm.
but it doesn't explain why it is wrong. Why
Right.
it is wrong to abuse a child. Why it is wrong to murder somebody for insulting my preferred religion, whatever. How does that? Where does it come from that you and I both feel that child abuser isn't just doing something that he evolved, that that wasn't evolutionarily advantageous? We feel that's wicked,
Mhm.
and I can see how again it could make us feel that way. But why is it? Because we don't, when we think about it, when we recognize, okay, look, this is how I am evaluating this behavior. We don't just say, well, that evolved in a way that's not helpful.
Mhm.
We say this is evil, and that seems to me to point to a law, to a rule, rather than just an evolved expectation or an evolved intuition. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? I've been talking a
I
while,
see
so
what I see what you're saying, and I agree with that because I think that um, there are two things there. One is that certain values that we have, or certain behavioral prescriptions, if we violate them, we feel guilty.
And you've
And
explained why we feel guilty. I agree. So,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
we feel guilty, and therefore, and I think so. One of our sources of what is morally wrong is, well, what is morally wrong is what we feel guilty about. Now, guilty is all different shades. I think I put in my book that I feel guilty when I run the water too long when I'm brushing my teeth,
Right.
because we're having a drought in California and I'm wasting water, but I don't feel that I don't think that's on the same moral plane as if I'd abused a child, for instance.
Right.
But I do feel it's similar in quality. It's just not similar in intensity and degree.
Sure.
So one of the things is that we feel guilty. The other is that we have I think culturally, and I think our culture teaches us that. I'm not sure that there isn't since everybody has feelings of guilt, I'm sure from an evolutionary point of view, there's a reason for feelings of guilt. And so they serve the survival value. So I'm not sure that feelings of guilt for certain things are not something built into us which are used for the end of keeping our genes alive long enough to reproduce.
But should I shape my behavior by those feelings of guilt? What makes those feelings of guilt actually carry anything other than just an evolutionary relic? I've got wisdom teeth. There's things that maybe don't serve a purpose now. Why should I care about those feelings of guilt?
I think I agree that that's a question, because for many people, I'm a psychologist, by the way.
Yeah, right.
That's what my degree is, and although much of my career was spent doing research on brain injury in children, I also was a psychotherapist. Much of the job of a psychotherapist is to remove guilt that shouldn't be there. That is, people feel guilty about things they should not feel guilty about. Sure. Because they feel guilty about masturbating, for instance. And for most people, I'm not, again, I'm speaking to a Christian, so I'm not sure if we have a middle ground here, but for most people, they feel that that's a normal part of growing up. Therefore, if someone had excessive guilt because they were told,
sure,
they should feel guilty about it, and they develop habits to remove that guilt that in fact end up being neurotic symptoms, you should try to get rid of the guilt in order to get rid of the neurotic symptoms. So we feel guilt about things we shouldn't feel guilty about, and it becomes, and this is even a debate within the field of psychotherapy, for instance. What should we feel guilty about, and what shouldn't we? It gets down to that should. Well, and that's a set of value systems, right?
And see, that's where it's intriguing to me, is how we can even speak of I should feel guilty about this or I shouldn't, if guilt is simply a relic of evolution. If that is where all guilt comes from, then what criteria do we use to say I should feel guilty about this or I shouldn't feel guilty about that?
Right. Well, though feeling guilt about a particular event is not evolutionarily determined necessarily. Guilt itself as an emotion can be, which gets attached to what your culture determines you should feel guilty about.
Okay.
So if you are taught in ways, there are plenty of people who are raised by parents who are excessively provoking of guilt.
Sure.
And people make fun of Catholic guilt, for instance, or Jewish guilt,
right,
or something.
Sure.
There's even religions that do it more than others, at least according to the comedians they do.
Right.
Really true. So we can attach guilt to things that the attachment of the guilt to the behavior is not evolutionary, it's determined by culture. And so then you can say, well, is that correct or not? Now, what it gets down to, well, how do you determine whether you should or shouldn't? What should you feel guilty about, or what shouldn't you feel guilty about? My feeling is that that is ultimately a cultural determination. It's one that we learned within our cultures, and there have been cultures that did not feel guilty about things that I would feel guilty about. Mm-hmm. We have within our own culture a time when people that I admire extremely, such as Thomas Jefferson, did not feel guilty about having a slave.
Sure.
And yet, I would feel guilty if I had a slave. So that was, but his views were determined by his culture that existed at his time, and mine are determined by my culture that exists at my time. So whether I think I should, because my culture is teaching me different set of values. Some of those come from religion, some don't, because they're people. Thomas Jefferson and I probably are relatively similar religiously.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I don't know if you. By the way, have you ever read the Jefferson Bible?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't read through it, but yes, he was very edited.
Yes, he took out all references to the divinity of Jesus, to the virgin birth, to miracles, or anything, but he loved the moral lessons.
Right, sure.
Which I do too. Mm-hmm. And always considered them actually more impressive if a human came up with them than if they were somehow given to us and we weren't capable of coming up with them ourselves. But anyway, that's a digression.
Sure.
So I think culturally is where we learn what should or shouldn't be. And your Bible is one of the cultural elements. My wife is a Buddhist.
Okay.
She's the most moral person that I know. She doesn't smoke. She doesn't drink. The word darn to her is a curse word. And she gives away virtually everything that's not almost necessary for living.
Yeah.
And she cannot pass a person on the street who shows a need without trying to do something for them.
And that's I would agree. In fact, in Romans, Paul writes, of the law written on the heart. And so that would be, my view is, the way that or the way that your wife knows, or the way that anybody knows right and wrong, that there is a that morality wasn't just written on 10 Commandments, but written on the heart by God. And that's, part of what I would see as the image of God in us, distorted by sin, distorted by the fall, etc. But yeah, certainly would agree that there's that it is possible to recognize and do good without needing to learn that propositionally out of the scriptures. But going back to your comment about how then culture tells us, so if we see it kind of backing up, then evolution, if I'm understanding you, you would say kind of predisposes us to through the survival benefit of certain actions, uses guilt or moral sense. It's kind of guardrails. Don't do this, do that.
Right.
And then as we come to today, as you and I sort through and try to figure out how now shall I live, that answer comes then from culture, which guides us to what we should and should not sort of take to ourselves from that evolutionary moral heritage. Is that a fair way of summarizing?
Yeah, I think so.
So then I guess to me that almost just puts the question one level back then of how do we decide if the culture is right or not. So again, to me, you're explaining the fact of how you could feel like I should do this or I shouldn't do this. For example, 200 years ago in India when a man dies and you burn his living wife on the funeral pyre. That's the reason you're doing that is because that's your culture.
Hmm.
150 years ago when you beat your slave, that's because that's your culture. Doesn't fully, doesn't excuse you morally, but that's the factual explanation of where those moral intuitions came from. But and actually, I don't know how you would answer this, so I'll ask this not rhetorically. Can we judge then, between the man who, beats and rapes his slave and the person from a different culture who doesn't? Can you say that one of those behaviors is actually better? Not you just saying it, but that actually for this person, he should not be doing this thing, even though his culture is actually kind of fine with it. So that's my question then. Would
Yeah. I guess I would say, first of all, I would say I can't step out of my culture completely. I can
Fair
try.
enough.
And that was part of what I learned from reading Jonathan Haidt's book, that I didn't realize that people actually differed and had other values than the ones I thought were normal, universal values.
Everybody has these.
Yeah. So I found, well, not everybody does, or if they do, they don't value them as much as they value these other things that I thought were sort of minimal. Um, so I can't really step outside of my culture and evaluate this person. I can make an effort to do so. So that one of my answers is that my conclusion that the person who beats and rapes his slave is morally wrong is still culturally determined. The second is that I don't feel it's cultural. In my gut, I don't feel it's culturally determined. I feel that I'm sure that the slave owner next to him who stops himself from doing those things is a more moral person than this person is. And I would bet that if I went back 2,000 years and I looked at Romans who had slaves, I would find that there was one who beat and raped his slaves and one next who didn't, because he felt it was wrong. And I still think the one who didn't is right, and I think that beating someone so that it hurts may be evolutionarily built into us as something that makes us wince, at least, and need a fairly strong justification for it. Raping someone may also, although all of these virtues, I don't know if you say not beating and raping is a virtue, but whatever it stands for, even though I say they're evolutionarily built into us, and you may say that God imbues us with them, looking back on history, it's a little hard to find them. People have violated them almost as often as they have fulfilled them.
And
people who believed in God and people who didn't believe in God.
I think that's I amen, brother. I mean that's, and I think that actually that to me that's the reason that the human solution doesn't work. To me, that's why, as I've said, the pagan person can be good, the Buddhist can be good, the atheist can be good. They can recognize good and they can do it sometimes. You can look back and say, here's take for example, Plato. By all accounts, Plato sounded like a pretty decent guy, good moral system. There were other people in his culture who were much worse by your and my lights. And I think by actually, ultimate truth, the lights of what actually is right and wrong. So, you have this problem then of, yes, all through history, people have recognized, I shouldn't be doing this thing that I'm doing right now. The slave owner who's beating his slave. Usually you do it behind the barn because you're a little bit ashamed of it, but you still do it. And that's the message of the gospel, essentially. That's the whole the scriptures is you know there's something wrong with you. You know there's something in you that you should be doing differently, and that there needs to be someone who can A, take the guilt of what you have done, and B, give yourself a new ability, make you, as the Bible says, born again, to something, and not to something perfect, but to something being sanctified, something being shaped into the image of right and wrong, or of God's picture of what's right and wrong. But backing up just a little bit, I think actually my point in raising this issue is actually perhaps more modest than you would expect, in that I actually think it's just revealing and significant, and about as far as we can go on this path for me, is just to say that you and me both, we do look back. And you said, at a gut level, we look back and we say that Roman, or that, person in Georgia 150 years ago, 200 years ago, whatever, they're not the same. The guy who's doing this horrible thing is not the same as this other guy. And we experience it, we can think of it in terms of, well, it could be explained. My gut level reaction can be explained by a combination of evolution and of culture. But the fact that I take my gut level reaction seriously, the fact that there's this feeling of again, I've not just encountered a fact, but I've encountered an obligation. I've encountered thou shalt not. To me, that's just a clue, littered in the world, that says there's something more going on here than just facts. That you can point to dolphins rescuing baby dolphins, but you can also point to lions eating their young. If it's necessary for survival. And frankly, in the scales of ecology, it's hard to value the lion or the dolphin higher. Lions trying to survive, dolphins trying to survive, and yet you and I have a feeling of this is wrong, which we experience. Again, gut level is a great way of putting it. We experience it as something more than a fact. We experience it as a command, really, of thou shalt not. You are better if you don't do this. And to me, that's just a clue. That's a suggestive thing that says there's a lawgiver, or that's evidence of a lawgiver who has very clear senses of right and wrong. And again, that leads me then to precisely what you said. Oh my, I haven't done the right. I haven't consistently been a good person. Oh no. And that brings then to the perhaps, if it's true, to the gospel then, this is the solution. But anyway, to me that's essentially as far as I would want to go, is just to say there's something out there that gives me a gut level sense of right and wrong, which I experience as more than just a fact. And that just seems to me hard to explain from a materialistic standpoint. And I guess in some ways that's kind of, I guess you could say, my closing statement, so I don't want to cut you off. If that, I'm sure, we said before we started the recording, we were talking, and I said I was pretty sure you were not going to finish this little chat, on your face as a Christian. So I'm assuming that you're, listening and thinking, well, I don't follow you to your conclusion here. So I'm just kind of curious where, and you've kind of expressed it already, but what would your closing statement so
only that I would agree with 90% of what you said, other than your final conclusion.
There you go.
Because I think that one of the things that culture, as it evolved, did, and culture doesn't have the same. When I say evolved, I just mean change,
right.
Not in a genetic sense. Is that it developed to reinforce some of these built-in prohibition feelings and tendencies that we have. So that cultures develop things like rules.
Sure.
Cultures develop things like commandments, things like that would punishments, which I think most of guilt is basically a fear of punishment, or fear of at least being viewed. That guilt is a fear that what I did will become public in some way. If you're If you're religious, it may be that it becomes public because God sees it. If you're not, it's that it'll become public because my peers see it.
Sure, sure.
And for all of us, it may have originally been, it'll become public because my parents found out.
Sure.
And I think that there is some evidence going back pre-Christianity, and that there were, there were all these rules. The Old Testament certainly shows that there were a variety of rules and in what right and wrong, and not necessarily, and punishments and things to be fearful for.
Certainly.
Much worse than most of us would ever want to have happening today. I mean, but if you look back on, like I said, my wife is Buddhist. Buddha preceded Christ by about 500 years. There are most of what Buddha apparently said was only written down about 400 years after he died, but it was still before Christ was born.
Certainly.
And has a lot of the very same rules for living.
Right. I wouldn't disagree.
Including not beating your slave kinds of things in there. And Hinduism goes back even further and has very similar kinds of things in it, so that there is evidence that human culture has sought to put into words and rules the kinds of things that people felt were right and wrong. And I think once they are put into rules, they have a stronger impact than when they were just a gut feeling.
Sure.
So I just don't see any need to go beyond that as an explanation, that's a natural tendency for humans to do that, to put it into words and to put it into rules. They like to write rules. They like to write things down, and then they expect people to live by them.
Certainly, yeah. And yeah, I think again that is a excellent description of how the fact of moral teaching comes about. Again, to me, I would explain it as the moral law written on everybody's heart, that Buddha could recognize it, the Hindu early teachers could recognize it, and that they did, codify it, they wrote it down. Largely, they got it right. You can be a basically moral person from a whole bunch of, Buddha, Aristotle, what have you.
Right.
But then again, for me, it's that explanation of the fact of where moral codes could come from just leaves me with that question of, but why is our experience of them an experience of something that is morally compelling? That's not just, again, I have this gut feeling and my culture tells me to, but that and why do we think of Buddha as a great moral teacher, which I think he was generally, because his teachings fit something that has on us a pull deeper than mere this is my instinct, like the instinct to eat, my instinct to drink, etc. But there, I guess that's pretty much sums up where our point of disagreement is then.
Right.
Is are those moral principles facts that have almost, because they're useful, they get codified, and then we follow it through cultural pressure, or is there something deeper going on, something a supernatural imperative? Well, for me, I had all these grand dreams of covering multiple topics, but I don't want to bore either you or our listeners.
Okay.
So I don't know if you had anything further on the subject of morality. I know we've sort of explored a little bit my questions as far as your understanding of morality. I don't want to cut off if you had any thoughts on that that you wanted to ask me.
I think you've been very complete and open, and so I don't feel like there's anything that I didn't express. I'm sure that when we stop talking, I'll say, gosh, I wish I would have said this or asked him that. But
well, I would love to
happy
have,
right now.
Excellent. Well, likewise. So I would love to sometime, when you have time, maybe we could return to that issue of miracles, or maybe we'll even both think of something we'd like to say further on morality or something along those lines.
Very good. Yes.
Well, thank you again very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too.
And I hope sometime in the future we can reconnect. So
Okay,
thank you
thank
very
you.
much. Well, I'm going to cut
Bye-bye.
off.